Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. I'll now give the floor to Ms. Leticia Damares, who's the director of CFAN, to give her opening remarks. Leticia, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Malet. Welcome everyone again, and thank you so much for joining us today for our virtual New York Climate Week event, setting a new climate finance goal. What's next for the new collective quantified goal process? We are joined today by a distinguished group of climate finance leaders and negotiators for a discussion on one of the most important ongoing climate negotiations, although it might have not made the headlines yet, the new collective quantified goal on climate finance, also known as Ncqg. We do love our acronyms in the climate process, but remember this one, Ncqg. My name is Leticia Damares, and I am the director of the Climate Finance Access Network that is hosting today's event. The Climate Finance Access Network, or CFAN, is currently coordinating a project titled Informing the Ncqg with generous support from the government of Germany. This project seeks to provide science, evidence, and equity-based input to inform conversations around the Ncqg. And as part of this project, we are producing a series of technical papers on those key topics of consideration for the negotiation process. And they can all be found on the project website, which I believe has been linked in the chat. This project is delivered in partnership with several organizations, including Climate Analytics, the Climate Policy Initiative, the Global Center on Adaptation, the Climate Finance Group for Latin America and the Caribbean, the Open Society Foundations, Oxfam, and South of North. Ultimately, we hope to contribute ensuring that the Ncqg effectively supports building resilience and promotes the economic transformation needed in the Global South to meet both the Paris Agreement goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. For those of you not familiar with the intricacies of the international climate negotiations, let me provide some context. At the 15th Conference of the Parties of the Climate Convention, known as COP15 back in 2009, developed countries committed to a collective goal of mobilizing $100 billion per year by 2020 for climate action in developing countries. The goal was further formalized at COP16 in Cancun, and then at COP21 in Paris, where the Paris Agreement was adopted. This goal was reiterated and extended to 2025. Fast forward to last year in Glasgow at COP26, considering the 2025 deadline is fast approaching, an ad hoc work program was launched to initiate the deliberations of setting a new global finance goal by 2025. So this work program started this year, and it has to conclude its work by the end of 2024 at COP29. As part of this work program, 4 annual technical expert dialogue and 1 annual high-level ministerial dialogue will be convened from 2022 to 2024. Since the beginning of this year, negotiators have been quite busy. Already 3 of those technical expert dialogues, known as TEDs, have been held in Cape Town, South Africa, Bonn, Germany, and Manila, the Philippines. And these dialogues have surfaced many of the key substantive issues that must be resolved in order to arrive at the Ncqg. While the first 2 TEDs really identified the landscape of issues and elements for further elaboration, the 3rd and 4th TEDs will focus on specific thematic issues. The 3rd TED that was in Manila earlier this month focused specifically on needs and priorities of developing countries, as well as sources of climate finance and the role of climate finance actors. TED 4 will be held in conjunction with the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh in November, and will be focusing on access to finance. But for today's discussion, we really aim to cover how a needs-based goal can be set. And we will begin with a presentation of a technical paper we published earlier this month, titled Towards a Collective and Quantified Goal Based on Needs by co-author Sandra Guzman of GFLAG. And this will be followed by a panel discussion. So we hope to really focus our conversation on some concrete next steps and ways to ensure that the Ncqg negotiation process remains equitable, transparent, informed by developing countries' needs, and science-based. I am joined by my other colleagues from CFAN for this event, and including our senior associate Malet Mcqt, who is coordinating the Informing the Ncqg project. And Malet will be also our moderator today. So thank you again for joining this event, and a special thanks to our panelists for their time. Over to you, Malet, wishing you good conversations.
Thank you, Letitia, for the opening remarks, and thank you for our panelists for joining us and also our virtual participants. So during our panel, our guests will share their views on the presented paper, the overall structure and layers of the new goal, and how the Ncqg process can remain transparent and participatory. We'll also talk through how the outputs of the tapes can be captured and connected to the bigger picture, how to best sequence the different issues and key milestones between now and 2024. And now I'm honored to introduce our panelists. The Honorable Ambassador Jeanine Felsen is an ambassador of Belize and a senior advisor to the Alliance of Small Island States and the Caribbean Community on climate and ocean matters. For more than 2 decades, she has been a leading voice for small island developing states in key negotiations, including the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Paris Agreement, and the Intergovernmental Conference for a New High Seas Treaty on Marine Biological Diversity. Ambassador Felsen is currently working with Melbourne's Climate Futures at the University of Melbourne. And next, we have Ms. Gabriela Blatter, who is the head for International Environment Finance at the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment, and she has been the Swiss lead negotiator for climate finance and the climate finance coordinator for the Environmental Integrity Group for many years. Gabriela was also part of the Swiss core delegation, which negotiated the Paris Agreement and represents the Swiss government in several international organizations, such as the Council of the Global Environment Facility. Next, we have Mr. Matthias Frömeri, who is Sweden's head of delegation to the UNFCCC and leads climate diplomacy efforts across government. Mr. Frömeri is a member of the UNFCCC Standing Committee on Finance. Previous roles include head of the EU Single Market, head of EU Policy, and head of strategic communications in the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs, as well as the EU advisor in the Prime Minister's office and postings in Budapest and Brussels. Next, we have Ms. Sandra Guzman, who's the founder of the Climate Finance Group for Latin America and the Caribbean, also known as GFLAC, working on areas such as tracking climate finance flows and needs, elaborating national strategies on climate finance, and mainstreaming climate change in public finance systems. She's the author of the Sustainable Finance Index and has created other methodologies related to climate finance tracking, and was previously the manager of climate finance at the Climate Policy Initiative. And she's also a consultant for the UNFCCC's Standing Committee on Climate Finance. Last but not least, we have Mr. Kishan Kumar Singh, who is the lead Trinidad and Tobago climate change negotiator for the past 24 years and has held various leadership positions internationally, including chair of the expert group on technology transfer and the chair of the subsidiary body on scientific and technological advice to the UNFCCC, co-chair of the ad hoc working group on Durban platform, during which he was able to table and adopt a decision on the nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, which now form the bedrock of the Paris Agreement. More recently, he has been appointed as the co-chair of the work program on the Ncqg by the president of COP26. Thank you to our panelists for participating in today's event. To our audience, it's also a pleasure to have you here. We will have a time at the end of the session for a question and answer, so please feel free to use the Q&A function to submit your questions. Our team will be monitoring and compiling those questions as we go. And now I would like to welcome Ms. Sandra Guzman, who's the founder of GFLAC, for the presentation. Sandra, you'll have a maximum of 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Malet, Leticia, and everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and have this conversation with dear colleagues to continue this important discussion about the Ncqg. I had the opportunity to participate in the last 3 technical dialogues, and I would like to start with a reflection. If you can go to the next slide, please. I think definitely, first of all, I would like to congratulate Keisha and Federica, the co-chairs of this important process, because it's clear that we are getting to the point where we are creating certain understanding around the Ncqg. And the first point is that the Ncqg it's a multi-level conversation. There are a lot of elements around this important goal. And of course, we have been discussing several elements, but I think it's important to start dissecting the different conversations. Of course, there is a lot of discussion about the principles that this goal has to follow, the sources that have to be part of this, of course, what is the allocation and what is the destination of this important goal. But I think one of the critical elements is precisely to understand how much, what is the quantity, because as we have been commenting, this goal is not only a number. Of course, it's very important to have that number, but it's also the quality behind it to ensure that this goal responds to what is needed. So in that sense, I think that the different part, or what is going to be very important in this goal, is to respond precisely to the needs of developing countries. And this is one of the critical elements that it's going to be very different from the previous goal that we had with the 100 billion. I think this is part of one of the critical elements. And of course, there is a massive discussion about how we are going to put together a quantitative number if we don't have enough information. Next slide. So that's why we put together a proposal. We know that this is a process, it's something that will take time because we have to discuss different elements around the new goal. But that's why we are proposing to follow a 4-step process where we can identify different elements that I'm going to explain a little bit now. But I think that the very first question that a lot of countries are asking is, well, how we are going to put together a goal, what is the number, how much is needed, where this number is going to come from, how we are going to respond to those numbers, how to bring it to the conversation. So I think the very first step, the next slide, please, is really understanding that we have now more information about what are the needs in developing countries. It's true that not all the countries have been able to assess how much do they need to implement their NDCs, these national determined contributions. Not all the countries have been able to determine how much they need for mitigation and adaptation, but it's true that more and more countries are providing those numbers and are reflecting those numbers in official reports, such as the NDCs, national communications, biannual updated reports. So differently from like 12 years ago, now we have more elements to say that, yes, we have information that we can start analyzing to set a quantitative goal. So as you know, the Standing Committee on Finance published in 2021 the needs report, which is a very important effort. Matthias was leading this process precisely to analyze what are those needs from developing countries. And the analysis show up that the developing countries need around $5.8 trillion between 2020 and 2030 to implement the NDCs. And this is more or less about $589 billion per year. A year later, the Aviva investors created another study following more or less the same methodology, quite different approaches, but more or less the same methodology, saying that, yeah, the cost is not 5.8, it's 7.8 trillion, considering the updated information that countries provided through the NDCs. And what those studies are telling us is that countries are starting to provide more information about needs. And of course, more information on updated information will really bring more the reality, what is happening in terms of what is needed. Why I'm emphasizing these two studies? Because there are at least 12 reports that are trying to estimate the cost of climate finance, but these two are bottom-up approaches, reports that are trying to understand what are those needs in the developing countries. So that's why it's interesting to understand this. So if we go to the next slide, please, if we take into consideration these studies, we would say that average developing countries are saying that they need average $600 billion per year to implement only the NDCs. And of course, if we consider what the decision says is that the 100 billion has to be the floor for determining this new goal. But what we know now is that the needs that developing countries have are at least or 600 billion per year. This means that there is an evolution, and it's information that we have to start considering from the quantitative side. Of course, this information that we have is still limited. No, we don't have all the information from all the different countries. We don't have enough information disaggregated per sector, subsector, or by timeframes. There is limited information about methods. There is very limited information about loss and damage. We believe that the adaptation needs are underestimated. And of course, we don't have a lot of information from local communities. But that doesn't mean that we cannot take this information to start discussing the quantitative side with these numbers that exist so far. Next slide, please. And in that sense, one of the proposals is precisely how to improve that information in the coming months and years. And the second stage is precisely how the COP, particularly the COP27, can emit a mandate to support developing countries in doing these assessments at the national level, because we know that it's time consuming, it's difficult, the coordination to do these assessments, but it's an important element to start providing more and more information, and the parties will need guidance, possibly by the standing committee, to do these assessments, as well as they will need support not only by the international, all the international bodies, such as the Green Climate Fund through the Readiness Program. Let's remember that the developing countries have to start reporting in the enhanced transparency framework. So supporting them in the determination of needs will be also helpful to start reporting to the enhanced transparency framework to really start identifying what are those needs. And this information can feed not only the new goal, but also the global stocktake and other processes in the coming future. The next slide, please. And it is important to say that determining needs is not going to be only important for the determination of the new goal. It's even important for the actual work at the national level. It's important to determine those needs, to really analyze those gaps that exist in financial flows versus needs. It's important to understand what is needed to implement and increase ambition of the national determined contributions and other climate policies. And of course, it is important to start building more coordination, because needs are not only a reflection of the central governments, also local communities, cities, and others have to be able to also determine those needs. Next slide, please. And of course, the point is how all this information, not only the information that we know now, but also the information that can be produced in the next months and years, can feed the process to start designing a new goal that reflects these needs. And of course, the first point is that we have to acknowledge that this new goal has a cyclical nature, cannot be just established 1 year and leave it there. It's important to start acknowledging that this goal has to be cyclical. And of course, the taking a new floor, such as the 600 billion, is just to start acknowledging that the needs from now and what we needed in the past have been changing. And of course, the countries have the big challenge to determine what part of that goal will be public, from public sources, what part will be from private sources or innovative sources. But it is important to be very transparent in what are the different layers that are part of this new goal. The next slide, please. And of course, just to emphasize, as I was saying, it is important to say that the needs will change and will change constantly. In the absence of mitigation interventions, the cost of adaptation and loss and damage will increase. Therefore, we have to think in this process, in the new goal, as a cyclical process, probably revised every 5 years. Probably whatever number it comes in 2024, starting in 2025, has to be revised Ideally, in my point of view, at least every 5 years, no more than that, because otherwise the reality really is changing a lot. And this analysis will also help us to analyze the progress towards the Article 2.1c to make all the financial flows consistent. So the goal will play another important role in the context of the compliance of this 2.1c. And the final slide, if you can go to the final slide, is just to remember that this is a cyclical process. No, we have to continue this analysis. If the countries keep analyzing, keep updating information about what they need every 5 years in the context of the NDCs, or every 2 years in the context of the enhanced transparency framework, the key point is to understand that the needs will change. And it's important that the financial flows, or the goal that is determined, respond to those needs to start increasing effectiveness, not only increasing the financial flows, but really ensure that the financial flows are connected to those needs to start really reducing emissions and, of course, reducing vulnerability. So very happy to continue with the conversation, and these are just some thoughts to start the conversation. Thank you so much, Malet.
Thank you so much, Sandra. And yeah, thank you so much for laying out all the 4 states or steps that you see in order to agree on a need that is really best, a goal that is really based on needs. And now I'll give the floor to each panelist, just like to keep it please to 2 minutes to respond to the presentation and share your views on how the Ncqg process can set a goal that is based on needs. First, Kishan, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, Malet, and thank you, Sandra, for the presentation and the paper. I think the presentation adequately captures the discussions that we've had so far in terms of some of the views that have been shared at the previous TDs 1, 2, and 3. But I think what is clear from what you have presented is that there is a need for continuous supply of data and information, and that there exist significant gaps in those areas, particularly in the area of adaptation, if I were to add a little bit context to that, because the adaptation data set is not as readily collectible, if you want to call it that. What is also critically important is, I think, that you have identified is the challenges that that developing countries may have in getting that data, and so I note the recommendation of maybe securing some kind of decision to support the provision of that data, including some kind of methodology. But notwithstanding that, I also note that there is some data already available, which can, mark a starting point, if you want, in terms of considering what can inform from a quantitative basis what that goal can be. But notwithstanding that, I think many of the qualitative aspects and the scope of the goal still can benefit from data, from information, issues related to the roles and responsibilities of various actors, for example, what they need, what they require, from both the public and the private sector standpoints. I think there's a disconnect in terms of what is required. So that's an information gap that is also glaring, that needs to be filled. So I think from your presentation, I think it chronologically and logically sets out the framework based on what we have discussed, what we have heard thus far, and maybe provide some useful steps forward for consideration as we progress towards determining this Ncqg. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Kishan. Gabriela, please go ahead.
Thank you, Malet, and thank you, Sandra. Good to see you virtually again for the input presentation. We've seen these figures before, and also the logic of the thinking. Definitely the cyclical aspect is something we have to think about, and also take into account the time frame, knowing how much time it takes, to take decisions and then mobilize resources especially now thinking on the public side. We have like these 4-year framework credits, and then the political processes and so on. So there was a beauty in the 10-year target because it left time for these processes to drive ambition and really unlock resources. At least in the Swiss side, we have increased our public finance very substantively in those 10 years. And we can really see that. And if you shorten the time frame, I don't know if you can keep that trajectory. Just questioning, maybe it's possible, but we couldn't fully confirm that at this point in time. The other aspect is the quantum on its whole. When Maria, I think in the Q&A already posed the question, why only 600 billion as a floor? I think the term floor here, I would probably rather see it as a goal than a floor. I don't know how you see the floor, but anyway. And then the question is, how do you finance that? And I would clearly say that the current donor base and sources that we're considering in the context of the 100 billion would not be sufficient. We would never be able to make that a goal in that number with that kind of setup. So we have to, if we think about the quantum in that scale, we have to completely rethink the structure. And I think we'll get to that in the conversation later on. But for us, definitely the logic of Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, how you capture that in the context of this goal, and the conversation about who will contribute, broadening the donor base on the public, but also on the private side, would be essential to get to that kind of ambition. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriela. Matthias, please go ahead.
Thanks, Malet, and thanks, Sandra, for the presentation. Good to see everyone, and greetings from Stockholm. Just 3 points from my side in terms of in relation to the presentation. Firstly, and sort of building, as Sandra referred to, the experience of the needs determination report, which we presented to COP26. I think one thing which we made clear then, when we elaborated the report and in the presentation of the needs determination report, is that we don't sort of put an equation mark between the needs determined and what needs to be financed by the donor community, for example, but rather the needs which are determined is for, and in line with the Addis Ababa development finance principles, those needs which are determined are for countries to ensure financing and resources for. Then obviously the donors, and now I can see we as donors, we stand ready to engage in dialogue with our development partners as to the extent that we will be there to finance and support the needs which have been identified. And of course, from a Swedish perspective, we're happy to see and proud to say that will be doubling our climate finance up to 2025, which, as many others donors have said as well. But I think it's important to make that distinction between the needs determined and what the new goal should entail, because for me, that's not the same thing. So that's one point. Secondly, in relation to 2.1c, I would see the new goal, basically as a sub-element of 2.1c. 2.1c, where all parties have committed to transform financial flows, and hence the new goal is sort of a sub-element of that transformation of sort of the whole package of financial flows. And my third point, was just sort of briefly on your suggestion for a mandate from COP27 on looking into what more needs could be determined. I would say let's not, but rather let's look at what we already have out there. I mean, there are already 9 different types of national reports that developing countries are set to do. So let's make sure that those reports can be completed based on perhaps more elaborated guidelines rather than sort of set out a new process to determine needs. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Matthias. Ambassador Felsen, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and I will build off of the points that have already been raised, which I think are fair points for our conversation. Thank you for the presentation. I think what's very key, irrespective of where we land on our views on whether or not it's possible to actually have a goal that can be iterative, I think what is important is that it needs to be dynamic. And there's no question that we're dealing with a scale of a problem and a pace of a problem that we ourselves have no control over, but certainly we do have the wherewithal to, including in technology and in finance, to address the issues with a sense of immediacy and urgency. So dynamism is a key point there. I think the second thing, just reflecting a little bit on what Gabriela has already said, I think it will be important to have operational elements to the Ncqg. It's not enough to just have a headline goal. It's important that we have aspects that are operational in respect of each thematic area. And that will necessitate a certain level of disaggregation by theme, by quality, by consideration of channels, because indeed, we're not just going to be focusing on the public aspects, but we'll have to think about the broader sources of financing and channels through which those could be accessed. And finally, I think the point that you've made about the importance of being able to understand needs through a mandated, sorry, I guess my connection is a bit unstable, but through some type of a mandate through the process to support countries with the identification of needs, to allow for bodies within the process to support that as well. I think that is of value. And it's a value not only for purposes of the goal, but as you rightly pointed out, it is a benefit for the countries themselves. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your valuable contributions and really responding to Sandra's presentation. Thank you again. So now we will move on to the panel discussion. And I just want to remind our audience, please, you can send your questions to the Q&A function, and we will have, after the panel discussion, we will have a session for Q&A, including if you have any questions for Sandra as well, we will address them after the panel discussion. So just moving on to our panel, first I have a question for you, Mr. Kishan. How can the Ncqg deliberation process remain participatory, transparent, and science-based and inform the goal? You're on mute, Kishan.
Yeah, so you'd think I'd be able to do this now fairly simply. Yeah, let me just preface what I'm about to say by underscoring that the issue of finance, as we know, within the entire UNFCCC process is one that is a sensitive issue, but at the same time, it's one that it's the only issue that actually engenders and builds mutual confidence and trust. We have seen that over the entire negotiation process, and I think we are at a stage now with this new Ncqg process with a huge opportunity to re-inject a high level of confidence and mutual trust in getting the international climate agenda moving and implementing the relevant actions that are required to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So with that said, and against that background, I think it is critically important that in order to build that mutual trust and confidence, that the process remains transparent. It remains open to all stakeholders to provide inputs, be it at the local level, be it at the international level, be it at the NGO, CBO level, but particularly the expert level, because what we have seen is for example, the need for more expert inputs. We recognize that at the first two tests, for example, because there's a huge disconnect between what is perceived from the public perspective on what is required to inform the Ncqg and to take actions from a public perspective, and what is required by the private sector, for example. And so, ensuring that we have broad stakeholder participation from the relevant experts remain a critical ingredient in facilitating the understanding that we need in order to design and to build this Ncqg. We've seen, for example, investment opportunities in the mitigation portfolios of countries being more easily definable compared to adaptation, for example, and that again sort of dovetails on the issues that were raised in Sandra's presentation of the gaps, the information gaps that are needed in order to inform the Ncqg based on the mandate that is given to the Ncqg on taking into consideration the needs and priorities of developing countries. So it is critically important in order to get that kind of information that the transparency remains open to all, that engagement is critically important by all stakeholders. So of course, we can only ask for engagement, but I want to underscore that it is critically important. But more so that the information that is provided by these many stakeholders really should inform the kind of bottom-up design of the Ncqg. Contrast that to what happened in 2015, for example, because I think it's recognized that the bottom-up process is more likely to fill all the identified gaps rather than any top-down. And in order to do that, all stakeholders are important, particularly the experts, and particularly where those gaps are continuously identified as we go from one TED to the other TED. And I think one of the major gaps in understanding, for example, is in the adaptation portfolios, where if there is a role for the private sector to be had, what do they invest in? How do you develop adaptation investment plans as distinct from mitigation plans, for example? How do you identify from a public sector perspective what is required by the private sector for investment, and vice versa? So these are sort of conversations that need to be had in a more granular and in a more interactive and engaging way as we go forward, because there are many gaps there that need to be filled, not only in terms of the role of the private sector, but certainly what, and we will do that in the next step in terms of access, but the types of instruments that may be required to address some of the issues that may not necessarily be readily addressed by private sector. And you understand the role of the private sector, for example, but there would be limitations to provision of finance from the private sector, as we have seen, for example, in the adaptation portfolios, whether it's from a thematic perspective or from a country level perspective. And in addition to that, we've also heard of the issue of loss and damage. But within addressing loss and damage is a huge lacuna in terms of assessing loss and damage, in terms of providing the information, the data, what is required to address loss and damage from a financing perspective. So there remains broad gaps, and I think transparency, engagement from all stakeholders is critically important as we go towards 2024 in determining what this quantified goal could be. I'll leave it at that, and happy to answer any other questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kishan, and also to keeping the time within the 5 minutes. And now I turn to you, Matthias. So the question I have for you, what should be the overall structure or layers and principles of the Ncqg be?
Thanks very much. I'd like to start by just sort of outlining a couple of thoughts on what we would see from a Swedish perspective being maybe what we could call sort of core elements of ensuring that there are resources available for financing climate action. And sort of this also sort of comes back to the needs which we discussed just previously, and looking at the needs determination report, for example. I mean, as I said, the needs determination report builds on the 9 types of different national reports which developing countries are already expected to provide to the Ncqg, everything from the NDCs to the LTSs to the NAPs and so forth. And of course, those can in some ways then, those are all designed for different types of purposes, but in some way they can all reflect different types of needs which have been identified. And then coming to sort of what we could then call the core elements, I mean, we would see that all countries have these various types of processes for determining these needs. And of course, they need to be reflected then in some way in the national priorities of the country itself. I mean, in our case, for example, I mean, it's reflected in our national budget process where we have identified what kind of needs we have to drive our climate action forward. So those would then be reflected in our national yearly budget, which we present to Parliament. Or it could be reflected sort of in our legislative program, you know, what kind of legislation do we need to take forward in order to drive climate action. So that's sort of maybe a first step to see how do we reflect the needs which we have identified in our national primarily then budget and planning processes. And secondly would then be, you know, how do we set about ourselves in financing those needs which we have identified. So through the national budget, and to the extent then that in this case then a developing country would see that they would be needing support to financing the needs which have been identified in terms that the national budget is not sufficient maybe enough to meet those financing needs. Then of course the donor community is there and ready available to engage in a dialogue on what kind of actions that we could then be supporting in financing. But I think there's also two elements of that. I mean, on the one hand, of course, what the donor community can do to support in financing those needs, but also what the global investor community can do. And that maybe speaks more to the design of the investment climate in a particular country. How do you make sure that the investment climate is there in order to attract the investment necessary to accelerate climate action? So, you know, it's just looking at those core elements again, you know, determining the needs, making sure that those needs are then reflected in your national budget and planning processes, and engaging in dialogue with both potential donors and as well as investors to secure that additional finance, all in line with the principles of the Addis Ababa Development Finance Agenda, and ensuring that there is this investment climate then which attracts the investment necessary to accelerate action. So, and then coming back more specifically to your question, you know, hopefully we can have a new goal which is reflective in some way of those, if we then again call them core elements. So how can the new goal respond to those kind of elements which all countries have? You know, obviously we all need sort of to set up our elements depending on what kind of national circumstances we have and what kind of sort of institutional structures and so forth, and what kind of, you know, federal or non-federal structures we have. But in some ways, sort of that the new goal would then be reflecting those kind of principles in order to ensure that the new goal as efficiently as possible meets the kind of needs which have been identified by various countries. But again, sort of coming back to the point I made previously, that sort of the needs determined is not the same thing as the needs to be financed by first now during this period by the 100 billion, and then after 2025 by the new goal itself. So sort of we have to keep in mind those, I think, that kind of terminology. Again, just a couple of thoughts from my side on the structure and principles. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Matthias. And now I move on to you, Gabriela. So the question I have for you is, how could the outputs from the submissions, we've had like 2 submissions in February and now August, and also the TEDs and also the high-level ministerial dialogues, how could they be appropriately captured and incorporated within the Ncqg process?
Thank you, Malet, and thanks also for the interventions from the other 2 already. On capturing the progress, when I'm looking at Kishan, it's going to be his job now, but he will be an important actor in capturing that progress, I would say. At least in our view, the reports that we are waiting for from the co-chairs of the ad hoc work program, of course, will be a very important ingredient. And from what we understand, there is the intention to have a report on the first 3, and then during the COP, an addendum that would also capture the 4th technical expert dialogue. So we have everything together in one product for the first year in terms of the technical expert dialogues. Speaking for myself, I found it very helpful, the informal notes that the co-chairs have produced, and I think they are an important element to bring the conversation forward. I think we would have probably preferred the notes to be a bit more forward-leaning and to maybe also enter thematic debates a bit earlier already. But we know that we're in the beginning of the process and there's time, and we can still have these deep dive, as we call them, on these various issues down the line. But yeah, I think for us, it's important that we don't always start at field one again, right? But we build upon what we have had in the conversations. It's helpful that there is a set of participants which keep participating in these TEDs. So it's not like a completely new setup every time, but we have participants that come and go, which is also helpful because it brings in new perspectives every single time. But the core set of participants that also carry on conversations that we've had may also be helpful in bringing the conversation slightly forward. But we certainly see the co-chairs in a key role of capturing this progress moving forward through their informal notes, through the report, and so on. And then there is the high-level ministerial dialogue. We don't know yet what will be discussed there. But personally, I think it would be helpful if we would have kind of this, and we said that already when we set up the ad hoc work program for the environmental integrity group. We said we would want the high-level ministerial dialogue to give political guidance to the technical level, and for the technical level to identify sticky political issues during their conversations on these deep dives and passing them on to the political level, not talking about them, but saying, okay, here we have a huge political issue that we clearly need to have a conversation about on a political level. And with that, the two streams can also better talk to each other and build up on each other's work. And then there's, of course, also the decision. For us, the decision is more of a kind of taking stock of what has happened in the year. We feel that the onset of the work program has been set in Glasgow, and we feel that the process is quite nicely set up. It provides the space for conversation. And so for us, the CMA wouldn't take any substantive decisions until we actually get to setting of the goal. And the main reason for that is that I personally really believe the space for ambition is much higher if we take an encompassing decision than if we take intermediate decisions on the way there. Very blunt, for example, the broadening of the donor base conversation or decision is a key enabler for elements of ambition. So if we detangle these elements, or if we try to take pre-step decisions, we might actually not get to the level of ambition that we may get if we provide an encompassing decision in 2024. Having said that, I think the informal notes and the reports and so on are an important element to capture emerging consensus and also showing emerging or still existing divergences between actors. That also helps us. If we know where the divergences lie, we also know where we need to spend more time on. And sometimes we also identify elements where we need more thinking, not necessarily divergences, but say, okay, this is last time, this whole question of how impact could be captured in an element, for example, came up. And honestly, I wouldn't have an answer to that straight away, but I think we need to have more thinking about that. And maybe also get more external technical input on that. Personally, very much appreciated the input from academia, from private sector, from just external actors of the process to really bring in the knowledge and views and different perspectives for the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. And I think this will also give it a good flow to my question to Ambassador Felsen. How should the process be sequenced to arrive at an agreeable goal? And what are the key milestones on the path to COP29 in 2024 when the Ncqg will be set?
Thank you very much for the question, and I appreciate all the views that have already been raised on not only the process, the structure, but also on how we capture progress. There is already a built-in stepwise approach to the overall process for the elaboration of the Ncqg, including, as you outlined in the beginning, the process of the technical expert dialogues, and then the interstitial political dialogues that will occur to help, as Gabby mentioned, provide guidance to the technical process and to perhaps unlock sticky issues where they arise, and they will arise. So that is important. I was just taking note of the questions in the Q&A with some concerns about the heavy focus on the needs on the demand side rather than the supply side, but that will come in due course. So we've started off with the discussion on needs because I think it's clear that we do need to have an idea of what exactly is the quantum that we're dealing with, but also to understand, the nuances of those needs. And I think Matthias has pointed to that. And in the recent dialogue that was held in Manila, I think there were some really helpful presentations on, how you actually talk about needs. It's not just country, but, there are many different levels of actors and needs that play into the whole response to climate change on the ground. And that is important when we're talking about a bottom-up approach. In terms of then the supply side, of course, the question will arise. And I should preface this by saying that, from my country's perspective, there is sort of a general conceptual framework that we would approach the Ncqg, not only talking about the quantum in relation to specific thematic areas, but also looking at quality and access, and then elements of transparency overall. So when we're talking about quality, of course, we think that this is a natural step that we start to discuss, what kind of finance will be made available. And I need to underscore here that in our view, when we're talking about a climate finance goal, we see this centrally through the prism of Article 9 and Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement, which speaks specifically to who the providers of finance would be. That being said, of course, there are aspects that need to be addressed in terms of mobilization, and that will necessarily mean engagement of other actors, including financial institutions, beyond the public financial institutions that exist. Then, of course, we would then want to discuss issues around access, access by channel, access in terms of recipients, access in terms of the types of procedures that might be able to be addressed in the context of what I mentioned earlier, in the context of operational elements for an Ncqg. And along the way, as we discuss these issues, we've already heard that we will be able to identify where there are gaps, identify where there are areas that necessarily will require some political guidance, and identify areas where we may need to take a little bit of a deeper dive for whether it's technical understanding or otherwise. I think I'm pretty much running up close to my time. I just wanted to emphasize here that because we're dealing with a wholly different, we're not in 2009. We're way past any point where we could say that we had opportunities to spend some time thinking a little bit further on how things will work, and trying to figure out ways in which we might retool our process. I think we're at a point where we need to see transformation, and we need to see it urgently. And so this goal needs to respond to that level of urgency and transformation that will be needed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Felsen, and thank you everyone for all your contributions. And now we will be going to the question and answer. We already have a few questions that were sent. Yeah, so Sandra, the first question. Yeah, so if we know based on more comprehensive reports, which still have substantial information gaps, that the needs are around trillions and those needs evolve depending on the warming scenario. Why are we placing the floor only at 600 billion?
Thank you so much, Malet. And I just want to emphasize one point and clarify another. In terms of why is this the floor? Of course, as I expressed, the information that we have so far is limited because there is not enough information about, for instance, loss and damage or even adaptation, as I was emphasizing. So what I'm trying to say is that the 100 billion floor that it was agreed, it is too low. No, like if we have to start a conversation about the design of a new goal, we have to take into consideration all the changes that happened in the last 12 years, and more information has been produced around needs. It's not the full information, but it's more information. So therefore, the floor should be different, no? Like we want to start talking about a quantum. And of course, 600 is just based on the evidence that exists so far. It's not that that's the only evidence, but it's the most comprehensive evidence. And that's why it's important to continue doing this analysis. And in that sense, I also wanted to clarify one point. So the idea is not to generate another completely different process, but it's rather how can the developing countries have support to do the processes that are, let's say, that they are following. For instance, they have to update the NDCs every 5 years. And one of the critical points is how can we support them in the creation of assessments that can help them to determine how much do they need to implement those NDCs, not only for mitigation, but also for adaptation measures. In that sense, generating guidance from the COP or the standing committee would be very useful to do these assessments in a more consistent way, in a more accurate or robust way. And it is very, very important to say that we're never going to have a round number around needs because the needs are evolving all the time. But it's what type of support can be delivered, can be provided to do this type of assessments in a participatory way. As a former decision maker, I can tell you it's very difficult, it's very expensive, it requires a lot of coordination, but it's possible to do it if they receive support to do it. Then they are going to use better methods, better processes to generate these numbers that will feed the conversation and like with all the backup, no? So I think it's important to have those guidance. And I would finalize saying that it's important in that sense to really build a transparent process where the different elements of the goal are determined. So for instance, as Gabby was saying, how we are going to mobilize. It's impossible to say that this 600 billion will come from the private sector, from the public sector. So it's what part of the goal will be from the public, what part will be from the private, and really start like creating those schemes and those different layers to really make it transparent and accountable. And in the next years, you will be able to say how much has been raised as part of this. And yeah, I understand what Matthias was saying about the difference between needs and the goal. But what I would like to emphasize is that a goal has to reflect or has to take into consideration, as the decision already said, the needs to create something that is more effective, no? Like just setting a goal, a number that is not responding to the needs. I think it's not going to be very effective if we really want to ensure the effectiveness side of the goal. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Matthias, do you want to come in now?
Thanks. Yes, if I can, just some thoughts on the 100 billion goal. I mean, it's because it's sometimes said, that the 100 billion goal, it's clearly not enough to finance the needs, and it clearly isn't. But then again, at least in my view, the 100 billion goal was never sort of set out to be sufficient to finance the needs in their totality for climate action. So there's also we need to be clear, I think, on what is the 100 billion goal and what is it not, and equally then, of course, what would the new goal be and what is it not, and that of course speaks also to this point on sort of determining the needs and then financing those needs, and how will that finance be provided. Another point which I think could be useful to raise also in this conversation is what are financial flows out there which are currently not supporting climate action. Fossil fuel subsidies, for example. How do we factor those in when also establishing the goal itself? Because on the one hand, making sure that finance is available to support climate action, and there's equally, funds which are then sort of going in the opposite direction. Another element which could be worth, factoring into this conversation is carbon pricing. When I speak to Swedish business community, at least, they say that the single most efficient way for them to increase their investments is to ensure that we have a carbon price in all countries. They would like to have a global carbon price, but I guess it's sort of more, for each jurisdiction to set out a global, some kind of carbon tax. And thirdly, just to pick up the point that Sandra made and others have said as well on capacity building, I think that was really a clear outcome from COP26, the amount of capacity building needed in sort of across the various agenda items we have in at the COP. When it comes to the transparency framework, when it comes to Article 6, when it comes to adaptation, mitigation, finance, and so forth. And maybe that's sort of something which we could have potentially as an outcome from COP27, how to make sure that we're sort of supporting countries and actually building capacity which is sustainable, not sustainable in the environmental terms, but sustainable in terms of institutionally sustainable. And how can we support each other in sort of making sure that capacity built is also capacity retained? Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Matthias. And now we have another question and sequencing of inputs. To what extent the outcomes of the GST process, that is the global stocktake, will be factored in? Also on moving from needs determined to needs to be financed, what will be the key principles to make that determination? Maybe I ask Kishan to respond to this, and others are also welcome to provide more input.
Thank you, Malet, and thank you, Piti, for the question. I think all of the UNFCCC related processes must be taken into consideration in setting this finance goal, because they're not divorced and they're not mutually exclusive one from the other. So the GST will have a critical part to play, not only in terms of the inputs that are now being discussed, but certainly the science, which I didn't refer to in my earlier intervention, but certainly the science is now informing what the needs are going to be based on the updated rate of climate change, for example, and what is going to be projected as impacts in the future. So I think it's not only about the GST per se, but it's certainly all of the other work programs, the global goal on adaptation, for example, the work program on mitigation, and everything that goes with it in informing whether we are on track to meeting the Paris goals. Because certainly finance is a cross-cutting issue across all of those the work programs towards achieving those goals. So I think all processes, not only GST, would need to be critically be considered as we near 2024, and 2024 being the year of the GST itself. In terms of how the finance is to be directed once the needs are determined, I would imagine, without being prescriptive, that they would be targeted to the areas where the needs have been identified. Otherwise, there's no point. But that would be my own personal opinion. So I think one of the principles, if I could even propose one, is that targeted finance would certainly be one of the principles when those needs have been identified wherever they may be. So that would be my response. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kishan. Ambassador Felsen, do you want to go next?
Yes, I just wanted to weigh in on this issue about the GST, because I actually wanted to pose it to Sandra when you were talking about the different cycles and you had the 5-year cycles. How did you see the GST factoring in there? because indeed, I think it is of relevance to how the entire Paris Agreement works. And I think that's important. Second point, the Ncqg is not a panacea. So there are other processes that obviously have been put in place that we would want to ensure also helps to assist with, you know, how we unlock finance. And I'm conscious that we do have from the Glasgow Climate Pact the mitigation work program, and the questions around, you know, how you're dealing with fossil fuels and eliminating fossil fuel subsidies and investing in energy, and discussions around that will come out. So I think we need to also keep our eye on the wider scope of processes that are there, and recognize that they have to be mutually supportive in the end to help us pursue the goals that we've set in the Paris Agreement. Thanks.
Sandra, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. And sorry that I went too fast in that part, but definitely I think what the GST is doing at this point is precisely learning as well from the experience from the 100 billion, and all those elements will be very important to feed the Ncqg and vice versa, because at the end of the day, the Ncqg, once is set, the global stock, they will have to follow the assessment of to what extent we are fulfilling that goal in the future. And it will be like a complementary process that will kind of go in parallel. So I think one of the recommendations to the co-chairs in several occasions has been how to ensure that the Ncqg, the adaptation goal, and the GST go like communicate in the different levels. For instance, to what extent it's important to create like workshops together, or like it just be like in this continuous communication to ensure that the different processes are connected because they are feeding each other. So I think this is, and of course, Kishan has been very active in that process. And I just wanted to emphasize one final point, and this is precisely about what Matthias was commenting. I think one element that we identified when we were analyzing the needs is it is important to differentiate cost and needs. A lot of countries are determined how much the mitigation and the adaptation measure cost, but they are already investing. A lot of developing countries are already investing in putting in implementing these mitigation and adaptation actions. And what they are, for instance, providing in the NDCs or in the other reports is what is needed. What is the amount of money that they cannot cover publicly that need to be covered by other sources, particularly international and private sources. So I think this discussion is also very relevant because it's not that all developing countries are just saying that this is what I need and I'm not going to mobilize resources, because a lot of developing countries are already mobilizing resources, but it's precisely this determination of cost versus needs, and how, and of course, unfortunately, in many countries, of course, the costs are the needs because they don't necessarily have the public's money to cover all those costs. But I think this is an important conversation because, as Matthias was saying, of course, it's going to be very difficult to cover all the needs, but at the end of the day, needs in a way should be the guidance, no, to set a goal that respond, no, to those needs and to really connect better those flows in the future. Thank you, Malet.
Thank you, Sandra. Gabriela, please go ahead.
Thanks. Actually, I just wanted to respond to some of the things which have been said by other panelists. And yeah, it brings me back to this like panacea idea. I fully agree with you, Janine. Yes, the goal is not the panacea, but that's also why I think maybe there's a certain tension emerging with, you know, Matthias and I saying, well, these 600 billion, and if then the statement is, well, the new collective quantified goal is 9.1 primarily, that's when you get the pushback of like, no, that's not our understanding, and then we would deliver under 9.1 the 600 billion. That's not where we're going. So I think we have, that's why like the understanding of the scope or the setup of the new collective quantified goal, I feel that very much we're still in this like old historic view, that it's like a goal primarily from donors to developing countries. And if that's the case, then we can also have that as a framing, and then that's the context we're moving within. But my understanding was that we're also trying to think a bit out of the box, and, for example, get into the conversation, the aspect of Article 2.1c, or of how we can get to this like better driving into the goal, also the private capital. And then there's also the question of domestic finance, right? If you have the 600 billion as the full investment needs, my understanding would clearly, or expectation would also be that we see domestic investments going into that. And I don't mean to diminish the already ongoing activities in developing countries. I know many of developing countries already, or all of them, put a lot of efforts in domestic investments into that already, but the costing exercises or these studies are based on the full investment needs for the implementation of the NDCs. And I would expect that these countries also put domestic resources into that. So if we talk about that framing, we have to have a broader conversation about what's part of the financing schemes at large as well. And maybe just like picking up of the question in the Q&A on the dynamism, you could definitely not quote that at least Gabriella or Switzerland has agreed to any 5-year dynamic, whatever. I certainly didn't do that. I think we're in a space where we're trying to understand what the requests and the needs are and how we understand each other. And that's why I put out this like 10-year time frame, at least, which from a Swiss perspective was helpful, because it provided this longer term perspective, which really was able to unlock the political ambition on a domestic level, which we need if we want to provide international public support. We need support in parliament. And if you have too short timeframes, that's difficult. But with that, I'm not saying yes or no or anything. I'm just putting out there the different perspectives on the same challenges. And we're happy to take into account other perspectives in terms of dynamism, need for urgency, and 5-year timeframes that we hear from others, right?
Thank you, Gabriella, for also responding that question. Ambassador Felsen, please.
Yes, I actually think that it will be very important in the process that that there isn't any attempt to sort of box arguments into to frame arguments or frame understanding in certain contexts that would necessarily generate perhaps unintended consequences. So I think it's fair to say that the Paris Agreement does have a lay of the land in terms of finance, and it is Article 9, which doesn't necessarily mean that a reference to Article 9 would box us into only talking about public sector financing. It also, of course, includes the importance of mobilization, which is, of course, a private sector related discussion, and I think that's really relevant. And of course, there is the wider discussion of 2.1c, which Sandra did mention. You know, the Ncqg will, of course, through its transparency and its ability to engage in a more accountable fashion, we would be able to then see in a better way how 2.1c, the shifting of finance flows, will occur. That would necessitate, of course, a discussion about the linkage between the new climate finance goal and, of course, our transparency framework. Because in that case, when you're talking about shifting finance flows, we will necessarily have to think about or look at overall reporting on how countries are doing, whether it's with providing or receiving or any other aspect of the transparency framework. So I think, again, I think it's really important to keep that wider perspective. I don't think, and at least, you know, for the most part from the discussions we've had in the TEDs, that there is an understanding that there will be a public sector component. There's also an understanding that there is going to be a private sector component. I think the framing that the Paris has is something that we can't really extricate ourselves from. So there is an article now that talks about climate finance. And yes, there is the overarching objective of Article 2.1c that exists. But I think we need to just take a very measured approach on how all the different parts will come together, because we absolutely do need all hands on deck. And I don't think that there is any illusion that we will be waiting at the the treasuries of Sweden or Switzerland to get our needs financed. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Felsen, and thank you, everyone. We still have a few questions in the Q&A function, but panelists, if you could respond to the questions directly, that is welcome. But now I think just moving on to wrapping up this, I just want to ask each of you, just reflecting on our discussion today, and what spirit are you preparing for the COP? And just like a concluding remark, 1 to 2 minutes each. So I'll start with you, Gabriela.
In what spirit I'm preparing for COP? Trying to sleep as much and spend as much time with my family before I address sleepless nights in Sharm el-Sheikh, but looking forward to warmer weather than in Glasgow, so that might add to the positive spirit at the table. No, honestly, I think we're preparing as usual with mixed feelings. To some extent, it's always nice also to see people again, to get back on the table, to get things moving. At the same time, of course, it's a lot of work and also always a lot of tensions. But I hope I'll get to see everyone, at least at the 6 which are here, I'm pretty sure. And it's always a pleasure to work with you, even if we don't agree with each other all the time. But that's what we're here for, right?
Thank you, Gabriela. Kishan, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. First, let me thank you for organizing this webinar. I think it has given some more perspective on aspects of the Ncqg, so that's very helpful. There's a lot of more work to be done, of course, because it's a continuous process. I don't think that we'll arrive at a quantified goal in Sharm el-Sheikh. If we do, then that's the end of the Ncqg. And while my spirit for this COP, as with every COP, is one of eternal optimism, I'm not that optimistic. It would be, in terms of spirit, optimism, not only in progressing in a constructive way the discussions under the Ncqg, but certainly in progressing on all aspects of the climate agenda that is now critically required, I think, and recognized by all countries as needed now more than ever in order to avert catastrophic climate change and meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So hopefully that global recognition can now translate into the rooms of the negotiations to arrive at constructive and progressive decisions. So eternal optimism in a nutshell. Thank you.
Thank you, Kishan. Ambassador Felsen, please.
I think I share that. Optimism is always the approach that that I would take into any negotiation, even if I know the odds are stacked against me. I think it's really important that we continue to have this type of conversation, frank conversation, and I think that really needs to permeate throughout the UNFCCC process. Sorry, I was going with the acronym. I think that there needs to be a greater understanding that, in fact, yes, we may not have the same solutions, but we certainly have the same objectives, and it's building on that common objective or common objectives that we can at least come to some better understanding of how we might be able to accommodate each other's solutions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Felsen. Matthias, please.
Thanks. I think I'd like to add to the optimism also determination. What we'll be bringing from the Swedish side to this COP, as we do to sort of climate action every day, is the urgency, but also the opportunities that we see in climate action and what it brings in terms of new jobs and economic growth. And that also speaks to, I guess, the new goal. I mean, how can the new goal contribute to ensuring that all countries can see those opportunities and investing for new jobs and growth in their pursuit of ambitious implementation of the Paris Agreement. And I think this has been a great opportunity to share those thoughts among colleagues, and also sort of having this, as several colleagues have highlighted, this opportunity sort of to look beyond, to the various processes we have now in place, both in terms of the mitigation work program, the meeting the global goal and adaptation, the Glasgow dialogue, the GST, but also processes outside the UNFCCC, such as work done by the coalition of finance ministers in ensuring that we're sort of aligning our both public and private finance flows with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So, by bringing all these various elements together in the process that Kishan and Federica so ably are leading, hopefully we'll come to COP 2024 with a new goal that we're all sort of seeing that meets the kind of needs and for all of us to be able to ambitiously implement the Paris Agreement. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Matthias. Sandra, please.
Thank you so much, Malet and colleagues. Well, I agree with Janine that the Ncqg is not a panacea, but I definitely see that it's an opportunity to connect the dots and to deliver an effective package that responds to what is missing in the context of the convention. So I really believe that if you guys can negotiate a goal that really reflects and responds to those needs, we are going to increase the effectiveness of the financial flows. And I really hope that COP27 allows to take those decisions that will help us to put together the information that is missing, and really to have the best of the goals possible, not as a static, but as a cyclical process that will be very important to keep revising in the future. So I wish you all the best as negotiators. I'm very happy to continue engaging, and thanks a lot for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, everyone. With our last few minutes, I would like to thank you for your participation in this critical conversation. We all know that we stand at an absolute vital moment in time in the climate crisis, and that climate finance is essential to catalyze climate action. The Ncqg and its deliberations will set the tone for future climate collaboration between parties, a process that is transparent, accessible, collaborative, and just as essential to creating a goal that is realistic and acceptable to all parties. Sandra's presentation set the scene, highlighting that developing countries will need between $5.8 to $7.8 trillion to implement their NDCs, or a minimum of $589 to $780 billion per year. And this remains only part of the picture. This is why we must use the information we have to begin to mandate needs assessments in countries where analysis hasn't yet been conducted, and regularly update those needs as part of a cyclical process. Our panel discussed how the Ncqg deliberation process can remain participatory, transparent, and science-based, and inform the goal. Kishan reminded us that while the Ncqg process will be challenging, it's also a consensus-building mechanism that will be vital to meeting our Paris Agreement objectives. As such, transparency and broad stakeholder participation across both public and private actors in the process will be key to its success. Matthias pointed out the need for the Ncqg to be reflective of the processes countries undertake themselves to determine and account for their needs. For example, countries often follow a process of determining their needs, ensuring their needs are reflected in national budgets and planning processes, developing investment plans that lay out investment priorities, and engaging in a dialogue with donor and/or investors. The new goal needs to be reflective in some way of these core elements and principles to meet the needs identified by various countries as efficiently as possible. In terms of how submissions, texts, and the high-level ministerial dialogues can be appropriately captured and incorporated within the Ncqg process, Gabriela noted that the high-level ministerial dialogue is important. We want this to provide a political guidance to the technical level. And we would want the technical level to provide inputs on political issues or sticking points to the ministerial dialogue. She also noted the broadening of the donor-based conversation is a key enabler of elevated ambition. Ambassador Felsen underlined that we need to have an idea of what the quantum is that we're dealing with to understand the nuance of the needs. She also spoke about the need to discuss access by channel, by recipient, by procedures should be addressed in the context of operational elements of the Ncqg. And finally, she reminded us that the Ncqg is a matter of urgency. We're at a point where we need to see transformation and we need to see it urgently. This goal needs to respond to that transformation. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you to our panelists for bringing their insight and expertise to bear. We have upcoming series of technical papers that will be published in collaboration with our partners that build on the key issues we discussed today. The next two papers will be on quality and access to climate finance and the Ncqg's link to the Convention and the Paris Agreement. You can stay up to date on this and find other resources on our website, cfinadvisors.org, which you can also find in the chat. Please, you can follow us there. Have a wonderful rest of your day and hope to see you at our future event at COP27. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.